It started like any other day at the barbershop. Clippers buzzed, conversations flowed, and the faint smell of aftershave lingered in the air. Darius sat quietly, blending into the scene, a man who appeared ordinary to those around him. But appearances can deceive. The door slammed open. A gang of men stormed in, their movements sharp, their voices cutting through the barbershop's usual calm. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The air thickened with tension. All eyes turned to the intruders, their presence commanding a silence no one dared to break. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the quiet man in the chair wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was Darius, a retired professional boxer, a man who had built a legacy with his fists and carried a lifetime of battles behind those calm, piercing eyes. This wasn't going to end the way they planned. What unfolded in that barbershop would become the story the neighborhood would never forget. A clash between arrogance and experience, chaos and control. Stay with us as we delve into the moment a gang pushed the wrong man too far. The barbershop was more than a place for haircuts. It was a sanctuary, a community hub where people gathered not just for grooming but for connection. The walls carried years of history, faded posters of classic boxers, team photos of local youth sports, and the faint smell of talcum powder that always seemed to linger. The hum of clippers mixed with laughter and the rhythmic tap of scissors, creating a symphony of life. On this particular day, Darius was in the corner chair, leaning back as the barber worked on his trim. His presence was unassuming. He wore a simple sweatshirt, jeans, and a cap pulled low over his face, hiding eyes that had seen countless battles in the ring and beyond. He was a man who came here for the same reason everyone else did, to enjoy a moment of peace. The shop buzzed with conversation. One customer recounted a basketball game from the night before. Another debated the best local barbecue spots. Darius listened quietly, offering the occasional smile or nod. He wasn't there to stand out. He preferred it that way. The door suddenly flew open, hitting the wall with a force that silenced the room. Conversation stopped, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Everything fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. 4 men entered, their strides confident and their faces hard. They were dressed in dark clothing, their expressions devoid of humor. The leader, Ethan, was a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, a mark that seemed to tell its own story of violence. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The warmth and camaraderie that had filled the room moments earlier were replaced by an oppressive tension. Ethan's eyes scanned the shop like a predator assessing its prey. He smirked as if amused by the quiet discomfort he caused. One of the younger barbers stepped forward hesitantly, his voice trembling as he asked, "Can we help you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the counter, dragging a hand across the display of hair products as though he owned the place. He turned to the room, his voice cutting through the silence. "Help me? Nah. I think it's time you all helped yourselves. By paying your dues." The words hung heavy in the air. It was clear what he meant. The barber shop was being targeted for protection fees, the gang's euphemism for extortion. The barber who had spoken earlier glanced nervously at the others, but no one moved. Ethan chuckled, a low and menacing sound as he motioned to one of his men. The enforcer stepped forward, slapping a wad of papers onto the counter. "This here," Ethan said, tapping the papers, "is the agreement. You pay us, and we make sure nothing happens to your little business here. Simple, right?" No one responded. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint buzz of a still-running clipper someone had forgotten to turn off. Darius remained seated, his expression unreadable. He watched the gang through the mirror, his sharp eyes assessing every movement, every word. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. To the gang, he looked like just another customer. Ethan's gaze fell on Darius. The leader tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Look at this guy," Ethan said, gesturing toward Darius, "sitting there like he's too good to get involved. What's the matter, old man? You think you're better than us?" The gang laughed, their mocking echoing through the shop. Ethan stepped closer to Darius, leaning over him. The barber froze, clippers still in hand, unsure of what to do. His gloomy eyes disappeared after a moment. Darius slowly looked up, his eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time. There was no fear in his gaze, no sign of intimidation, only a calm, almost eerie stillness. Ethan didn't seem to notice. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to say something?" The room was suffocating with tension. The other customers and barbers avoided eye contact, too afraid to intervene. Darius, however, remained composed. His hands rested lightly on the armrests of the chair, his body language relaxed. Ethan straightened up, clearly unsatisfied by Darius's lack of reaction. He motioned to one of his men. "Maybe we need to show him we mean business," Ethan said. The gang member stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. But before he could take another step, Darius finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "They won't be necessary." The simple statement hung in the air, carrying a weight that caused even Ethan to pause. The gang exchanged uncertain glances, not sure what to make of the quiet man in the chair. The barbershop felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Darius remained still, his eyes locked on Ethan. It was the calm before the storm. The tension in the barbershop reached its peak, the silence nearly deafening. Ethan's smirk returned as he nodded to one of his men, signaling for the enforcer to move toward Darius. The gang member approached with a slow, deliberate swagger, clearly confident in his ability to intimidate. The rest of the gang leaned against the counter, laughing and jeering, their bravado filling the room. Darius remained seated, his body calm but subtly alert. His barber, visibly shaken, stepped back, clutching the clippers as though they might offer some form of protection. The enforcer, a burly man with a menacing glare, leaned down toward Darius, his face mere inches away. "You got something to say, old man?" the enforcer sneered, his voice thick with mockery. Darius's response was measured, his voice low but firm. "I've said enough." The enforcer's laugh was short and harsh. "Wrong answer." Without warning, he reached out, grabbing Darius by the collar in an attempt to yank him out of the chair. But Darius didn't move as expected. Instead, in one fluid motion, he shifted his weight, his hand shooting up to grip the enforcer's wrist. A split second later, the room erupted. Darius rose from the chair with a speed and precision that caught everyone off guard. The enforcer stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his expression a mix of pain and shock. The gang erupted into chaos, with Ethan barking orders and the other members rushing to back up their fallen comrade. What followed was a display of raw skill and power. Darius's movements were calculated, each punch and block a masterclass in technique. His years in the ring were evident in the way he controlled the fight, his fists landing with pinpoint accuracy. One gang member lunged at him with a knife, but Darius sidestepped effortlessly, delivering a sharp uppercut that sent the man sprawling. The barbershop was in disarray, chairs overturned and hair products scattered across the floor. Customers and barbers scrambled to get out of the way, their fear giving way to awe as they watched Darius dismantle the gang. Ethan, the leader, hesitated for a moment, clearly reevaluating the situation, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He grabbed a metal chair, swinging it toward Darius with all his strength. Darius ducked just in time, the chair crashing into the wall behind him. He countered with a swift jab to Ethan's ribs, followed by a powerful right hook that sent the gang leader to the ground. The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun. The gang lay scattered around the shop, groaning in pain. Darius stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing steady, his expression calm. He adjusted his shirt and looked down at Ethan, who was clutching his side and glaring up at him with a mixture of rage and humiliation. "You come back here," Darius said, his voice steady and commanding, "and it won't end this well for you." Ethan didn't respond. He simply gestured to his crew, and one by one they stumbled to their feet, limping out of the barbershop. As the door swung shut behind the gang, the silence in the barbershop was broken by a collective exhale. The customers and barbers stared at Darius, their expressions a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Man," one of the younger barbers finally said, "where did you learn to do that?" Darius shrugged, his demeanor as calm as if nothing had happened. "A long time ago," he replied, taking his seat again. The barber who had been working on Darius earlier stepped forward, hesitantly, picking up the clippers he had dropped during the commotion. "Should we call the police?" he asked, his voice still shaky. Darius shook his head. "No need. They got the message." The community was in awe of what they had just witnessed. Darius, the quiet man who came in for a simple haircut, had defended their space with a strength and confidence that inspired both relief and respect. As Darius left the shop that day, he could feel the eyes of the barbers and customers on him, their silent gratitude palpable. But he also knew that this wasn't over. Men like Ethan didn't take defeat lightly. The signs were subtle at first, but Darius noticed them. A car parked across the street from his house, its occupants lingering longer than necessary. The occasional shadowy figure at the edge of his vision when he walked through the neighborhood. Ethan and his crew weren't done. They were watching, waiting for an opportunity. One morning, as Darius approached the barbershop, he found a note taped to the door. The handwriting was crude, the message clear. "This isn't over." Inside, the barbershop staff were on edge. One of the barbers mentioned seeing unfamiliar faces lingering near the shop after hours. Another reported hearing strange noises outside his home. "They're trying to scare us," Darius said, his tone matter-of-fact. "But fear only works if you let it." Ethan and his gang escalated their tactics. Windows were smashed, graffiti appeared on the barbershop walls, and the staff found their tires slashed more than once. It was a campaign of intimidation, designed to make the community feel helpless. But Darius was not a man easily intimidated. He began preparing, reaching out to trusted allies and quietly fortifying his defenses. He knew the gang would eventually make their move, and when they did, he would be ready. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only the fate of the barbershop, but also the resolve of a man who had spent his life fighting battles, both in the ring and out. The events of the past week weighed heavily on Darius. The gang's escalating intimidation tactics had shaken the community, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. Darius knew this wasn't a fight he could win alone. Not this time. The stakes were too high, and the gang's numbers had grown. It was clear Ethan was recruiting reinforcements, determined to settle the score and reclaim his reputation. Darius spent the next few days reaching out to old friends, men who had shared the ring with him in his younger days. These were people who understood discipline, strategy, and how to handle pressure in the heat of a fight. Many of them had retired like Darius, but the bond they shared remained strong. When he explained the situation, there was no hesitation. They knew what was at stake and were more than willing to stand with him. The group gathered at Darius's home to strategize. The conversation was serious but focused, each man bringing their own expertise to the table. They discussed the gang's likely movements, the weapons they might bring, and how to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. For Darius, this wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting the community. "We don't wait for them to strike again," Darius said, his voice steady. "We take control of the situation. We set the terms." The plan they devised was simple yet effective. They would lure the gang into an area where they had the advantage, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The space was large enough to control the confrontation, but contained enough obstacles to limit the gang's ability to overwhelm them with numbers. The night before the confrontation, Darius walked the streets of the neighborhood, observing the quiet houses and dimly lit windows. He thought about the people who called this place home, the barbers, the families, the children who played on these streets. They deserved to live without fear. That thought strengthened his resolve. The following evening, the warehouse was eerily silent. Darius and his team positioned themselves strategically, using the shadows and crates for cover. Each man knew his role and had rehearsed the plan. They waited, their breaths steady, their focus unwavering. The sound of engines broke the silence, growing louder as the gang's convoy approached. Ethan wasn't taking any chances this time. He had brought nearly a dozen men, all armed with weapons ranging from bats and chains to knives. Their confidence was evident as they poured into the warehouse, their laughter and taunts echoing in the vast space. Darius stepped out first, his presence commanding. He stood in the center of the room, his posture calm but powerful. The gang froze for a moment, taken aback by his boldness. "Ethan," Darius called out, his voice carrying through the warehouse. "This ends tonight." Ethan smirked, motioning for his men to spread out. "You really think you can stop us, old man? You're outnumbered." Darius's response was simple. "Try me." With that, his team emerged from the shadows. The gang's laughter faltered as they realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary group of men. These were seasoned fighters, each one exuding the confidence of someone who had faced adversity and come out stronger. The fight erupted in a flurry of movement. Darius's team worked in perfect sync, using their surroundings to their advantage. They anticipated the gang's moves, countering with precision and speed. Darius himself was a force to be reckoned with, his years of training and experience evident in every punch and block. Ethan, determined to prove himself, went straight for Darius. Their clash was intense, each man pushing the other to their limits. Ethan fought with brute strength, but Darius countered with skill and strategy, wearing him down with calculated blows. Despite their weapons, the gang was no match for Darius and his team. One by one, they fell, their confidence replaced by panic. The tables had turned, and it was clear they were outmatched. Just as the fight reached its peak, the sound of sirens filled the air. The gang members froze, their fear palpable as the warehouse was bathed in the flashing lights of approaching police cars. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Darius and his team stepped back, their hands raised in a show of compliance. They had anticipated this moment and were prepared to explain their actions. The gang, however, wasn't as composed. Some tried to flee, only to be apprehended by the officers waiting outside. Ethan was among those arrested, his bravado finally shattered. As he was led away in handcuffs, he shot one last glare at Darius, but the older man's expression remained calm. Darius and his team gave their statements, detailing the events that had led to the confrontation. The officers, recognizing the gang's history of intimidation and violence, were sympathetic to the community's plight. While the situation was far from ideal, it was clear that Darius's actions had been a last resort. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. The gang's hold over the community had been broken, their intimidation tactics no longer a looming threat. The barbershop reopened, its walls repaired, and its atmosphere once again filled with laughter and conversation. Darius became something of a local hero, though he downplayed his role. For him, the fight had never been about recognition. It was about standing up for what was right and protecting the people who mattered to him. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, Darius reflected on the events that had unfolded. The fight had been won, but he knew the battle against fear and violence was ongoing. Still, there was hope, a renewed sense of strength within the community and a belief that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story ended not with a definitive conclusion, but with the promise of resilience. The scars left by the gang's reign of terror would take time to fade, but the community was stronger now, united by the courage of one man and the willingness of others to stand by his side. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales you don't want to miss.